So, good afternoon, everybody. What a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much, Gary, for inviting me to this amazing conference. And also, I feel very honored to be able to tell you the story about what we have called animating the carbon cycle through rewilding. And I would like to have the next slide, please. I would like to start the journey in Serengeti and tell you the story about the wildebeest. I mean, we all know about this fantastic natural treasure with a population of 1 million wildebeest migrating over the Serengeti plains every year. But this has not always been the case. So about 100 years ago, the population was down to about 300,000, and the reason for that were two. There was quite a heavy poaching pressure, but also, and the main reason for the low number was there was a rinderpest infection. So it came from the cattle ranching around the Serengeti and killed the wildebeest. And at that time, there was a huge accumulation of dead grass because there was not enough herbivores on the Serengetis. So every year, about 80% of the Serengeti was burnt. There was wildfires. And at that time, the Serengeti was a net emitter of CO2. And then in the 50s, the cattle ranchers introduced a vaccine to stop the rinderpest, and that of course benefited the wildebeest. And also at that time, they were able to control the poaching. So the population started to grow. So today we are back to where we were, and about 1 million animals. And what has happened in the ecosystem, of course, is that all the dead grass has more or less been removed. And as a result of that, there are hardly any wildfires. And also because of the dung, the process of capturing carbon in the soil has actually increased significantly. So today it's a carbon net sink. And it captures every year roughly the amount of carbon that is generated in Kenya or in Tanzania through fossil fuel burning. So I think it's a beautiful example of how one single species then is what we call animating the carbon cycle. Can I have the next slide, please? So this mechanism, there are several mechanisms that is linked to this concept of animating the carbon cycle. It can be predators influence, and not just the numbers also, but the behavior of herbivores. We also, yes, we heard already about influencing the natural fires. They can also then facilitate soil uptake. And in the Arctic, herbivores reduce permafrost melting. And also species influence the nutrients flow. For instance, the big whales or migrating fish. Mammals also, and birds facilitate large trees. So basically, these are kind of mechanisms that are related to animating the carbon cycle. Can I have the next slide, please? We heard this morning about the need to not go beyond 1.5 degree target. And we have a particular challenge here. I mean, it's not enough if we just go carbon neutral by 2050. And that we stop the destruction of like forests in the world. We have a lot of excess carbon in the atmosphere already. So there are estimates then by the IPCC that we have that kind of excess is between 100 and maybe 1,000 gigaton carbon dioxide. There was a study done by the Sydney University 2-3 years ago. And they came up with a proposal to identify specific targets of 500 gigaton removal targets by the end of this century. Just to give you a little bit of perspective of that target, it's about 13 to 14 times the annual emission of all fossil fuel globally. So I've been part of a study this spring to assess what is the potential of animating the carbon cycle. So because I forgot to say that there is no technical opportunity right now to remove that 500 gigaton. We are completely dependent on nature. So we ask ourselves, what is the potential for animating the carbon cycle to actually remove that? So next slide, please. So I've been involved in part of a study to look at what we know about the potential of animating the carbon cycle in different systems. And it's a group of 10 scientists. It's led by Professor Oswald Schmitz at the Yale University. And we looked at 10 different species and species groups. And basically, those 10 groups annually remove about close to 6 gigaton of carbon dioxide. So, I mean, the prospects of these only 10 species are actually quite promising. I mean, they could basically meet that kind of a 500 gigaton target by the end of the century. But there is a challenge. So next slide, please. So out of that group, the biggest, let's say, component consists of marine fish. And marine fish, they contribute in this sample of 94% of this target. Can I have a next slide, please? The problem with the fish is basically that most of the fish consist of what they call mesopelagic fish. These are fish that are living between 200 and 1,000 meters deep. In fact, that's the largest vertebrate group on the planet. Was a surprise to me, at least I didn't understand that. And then basically this group alone contributes every year to the capture of 5.5 gigatons. And if you just put that in the context, that is about twice the emission of the EU 27 countries, or 4 times the emissions of the whole of Africa. So it's a very significant group of animals. And these animals and these kind of systems have not been accounted for at all in the climate modeling so far. The challenge with this, next slide please, is that most of these fish, mesopelagic fish, they live outside the territorial waters. And so, as you know, there is a high seas treaty under negotiations now, under UNCLOS. But for political reasons, there was at the beginning a discussion to put a fishing ban as part of the UNCLOS, but that has been abandoned. But now at least there is an agreement to put together, have a global target on protection. And so I think it's very important, since there will be no fishing ban, if you want to protect those fish populations, you need to have a no-take zones of these of this 30 by 30 target. And actually Australia is part of something called the High Coalition to look and have actually so subscribed to this 30 by 30 target. So I think I would really strongly recommend to advocate for a no-take. Next slide, please. And just talking about global targets and policy frameworks, there is now under negotiations under CBD a target 8, where they talk about every year to remove up to 10 10 gigatons of carbon. If we just look at this species group or group of species that we have now analyzed, they alone would contribute to more than 50%. Next slide, please. But as we understand, I mean, this is just the top of the iceberg. Yeah? There are many, many candidate species. And some of the candidate species are listed here, and maybe I don't need to go through them, but certainly in this paper that is now which will be published, they are identified. So next slide, please. And in the paper that has been submitted to me by Gary on the Great Eastern Ranges, he has listed a number of species that could have this kind of potential animating the carbon, both in terms of seed dispersal, pollination, forest engineering, nutrient replenishment, and predation. So there are certainly a lot of prospects here in the Great Eastern Ranges for animating the carbon cycle. Next slide, please. I think reptiles is hardly any, very seldom discussed in this context. And I mean, reptiles in general are very unpopular players in ecological processes. And since Australia hosts the largest number of reptiles in the world, I think per country, I think this is a forgotten group, and I think it's something I would strongly recommend to look into in Australia. Next slide, please. Before I came here, I discussed with Oswald Schmitz about the context of this conference and the connectivity and so. And we would then like to propose that when it comes to connectivity and planning, we should really create climate positive seascapes and landscapes. And if you really add the concept of animating the carbon cycle or look at particular species, I think we could really create super positive climate landscapes here, or seascapes. So that's something we would recommend. And finally, next slide, please. I'm here on behalf of something called Global Rewilding Alliance, and since we started 1.5 years ago, we have focused a lot on animating the carbon cycle as a kind of interface between climate and biodiversity. So we have set ourselves to make a contribution to this 500 gigaton carbon. We organized at the launch of something called the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, a webinar on this, and we got participants from more than 40 countries. We created an open letter which was signed and submitted to COP26 last year. And we have produced a layman report on what we know about this, which is available if you would like. And now we are having this scientific paper that has been submitted to the Nature Climate Change Journal and will be published later this autumn. And then finally, we're working on an ACC, what we call a reference book, looking at both the science but also the policy, and we're looking at economics and socio-economics and other aspects on how to implement this concept globally. And that will be also published by the Springer Förlag in early 2024. So the last slide, please. So we think the ACC provides a very interesting framework for the interface between biodiversity and climate change. So as we say, one solution for two problems. We also think the ACC provides and increases the potential for resilience of ecosystems. Hence, we will also then reduce the risk for society. And finally, also, we conclude, I mean, we can't meet the 1% climate target without animating the carbon cycle. There is simply no way we can do that. Thank you so much for your attention.